Alright, in honor of this fine English beer style, I'll be doing the rest of the episode in an offensively bad English accent. Would you like a spot of tea? Yes! Now flourish the pinky. No, wait, that's a terrible idea. It's a good episode of Sunny in Philadelphia, but a bad idea for this podcast. I'll just continue in boring old American English. If watching that show has taught me anything, it's that you should never behave the way the Sunny Gang does. Similar to our previous beer, APA, porters are a surprisingly versatile style. Whereas some are bitter and hefty, others are easy drinking enough to pull out on a hot summer day. A lot of people shy away from dark beers, but porters are a viable year-round option. They can be smooth and refreshing, and I don't think a lot of people realize this. I can't tell you how many people I've heard say they can't drink Guinness Draft because they don't like those heavy beers. Not that Guinness is a porter, it's not, it's an Irish stout. But something about dark beer scares people off. Guinness Draft is a fairly light beer. It's only got 15 more calories than a Bud Light. And for being a stout, it's quite thin. So don't let the dark beers fool you, is what I'm saying here. Many of them are quite drinkable. Irish stouts, black lagers, a lot of English porters. They're all great options if you don't like heavy beers, but you want to venture over to the dark side. I remember one of the first beers I had when I was getting into different styles was an English porter. It was at this place in Sunset Hills called Growlers. It's not there anymore. It closed in 2013, I think. But it was a great place. They had something like 131 beers, and they would give you a punch card. So if you tried them all, you would get an engraved stein or something. But I tried tons of beer styles for the first time there. And one of the first ones I tried was an English porter called Entire Butt, which I tried because of the name, obviously. It wasn't until years later that I learned that Entire Butt is a reference to one of the many possible origin stories for the style. I'll get into that more later, but that just goes to show how much history there is with beer. Like, I tried this random beer because it had a dumb name, which turned out to be a clever historical reference from the early 1700s. It's crazy. Also, I mentioned Sunset Hills before, which is one of the many municipalities in St. Louis County, where there are just under 100 different municipalities. It's like every neighborhood has its own small local government. It's bonkers. The Sunset Hills neighborhood is in South St. Louis County. Another weird thing, St. Louis is an independent city, which means it is surrounded by, but not a part of, St. Louis County. It's its own separate thing. I couldn't tell you why. That's one reason why St. Louis has such a high murder rate per capita. The crime reporting agencies who compile that data don't count the population of St. Louis County, so things look worse than they actually are. There are a lot of people in the county, and not nearly as much violent crime, so the stats become kind of skewed. Don't get me wrong, this is still a violent-ass city, but it's not half as bad as some would have you believe. It's all about how the information gets presented, you know, but whatever. That's just some weird shit about St. Louis. It doesn't have anything to do with English porters, but I felt like talking about it. Let's move on. I know. I'll read the overall impression thing from the guide thing. Jesus. The guide says, a moderate strength brown beer with a restrained roasty character and bitterness. May have a range of roasted flavors, generally without burnt qualities, and often has a chocolate caramel malty profile. Hell yes. That sounds quite tasty. I rather like porters. I'm more partial to stouts, but a well-made porter is nothing to sneeze at. These days, in America at least, I would say the American porter style is more popular, with it having more alcohol and a bolder character. But the English porter is worth seeking out. The biggest issue you're going to run into is going to be finding fresh ones. That seems to be the case in the Midwest anyway, and I can't imagine it's much different in other parts of the US. I could be wrong. That's the issue really with a good chunk of imported beers, is finding fresh ones. But it's especially difficult with these English beers that aren't made to sit on shelves. Like I said in the episode on APAs, almost all beer is best when consumed as fresh as possible. But English beers especially have a tendency to fall apart if you don't drink them right away. That's a problem when it takes so long to get it packaged and shipped and distributed and on the shelf and bought and eventually drank. By the time you go through all those steps, your lower ABV English ales are usually already dead. Drinking them on draft is a good alternative, but then you have to find a bar that has a draft English porter, and that's not easy either. We have the Civil Life Brewing Company in St. Louis, which is a cozy little place that happens to specialize in English-style beers. So they might be able to accommodate you in your search for a beautifully fresh English porter, but other cities might not have a spot like that. English beers are not big business on this side of the Atlantic, which is a shame because they are quite tasty. They are malty beers, to be sure. They kick out biscuity, bready, toasty malt aromas, sometimes with a bit of roastiness, sometimes with chocolate. The more complex ones will even have some underlying toffee or caramel or nutty character. You should get some fruity esters, and you may get a little hoppiness. It won't be that big, citrusy American hop character, though. This will be more typical of an English hop, so more earthy, floral. That's all going to carry through to the flavor, too. The malt will be much more present in the flavor, so those toffee notes, those nutty notes, and the toasty breadiness will dominate the taste. You might get a little bit of roast, but it shouldn't be harsh. It should be very subtle. That floral hoppiness will be fairly well concealed, and any bitterness from the hops will be purely for balance. The beer shouldn't come off as sweet. It should be fairly well attenuated. In other words, it should be dry, which as far as beer and wine are concerned is the opposite of sweet. As it relates to brewing, attenuation is the percentage of sugars that get consumed by the yeast during fermentation. So the higher the attenuation, the drier the beer, and the higher the alcohol content. That's a really simplistic definition, but maybe I can get Thomas to give us a more detailed explanation of attenuation. For now, that'll have to do. But attenuation relates not only to flavor, but to mouthfeel as well. So when I say mouthfeel, that's the physical sensation the beer has in your mouth. Oh, it's sexy, I know. Body, carbonation, creaminess, astringency, alcohol warmth, these are all things that make up a beer's mouthfeel. It can take some practice to differentiate between mouthfeel and taste, for sure. That's why it pays to exercise your palate, by drinking lots of different styles of beer. Temperature and carbonation levels affect mouthfeel too, but not as much as attenuation. Whereas well-attenuated beers are crisp and dry, less attenuated beers are fuller, richer. They're also sweeter since there's more residual sugar. The more sugars and proteins in the beer, the more full-bodied it will be. Makes sense, right? That's why attenuation is such a big factor in a beer's overall body. An English Porter, for instance, is a medium-bodied beer. It will typically have a moderately low level of carbonation, but you will run into some that have decent carbonation. It's not necessarily wrong for them to be more carbonated. Not stylistically, it's just atypical for English beers in general to have a ton of carbonation. English Porters also have a very pleasant creamy texture that makes them easy to drink. They are seen by many as being dark, opaque beers, but in reality, English Porters are brown. They can range from a light reddish brown to a darker brown, and many have ruby highlights that can be seen by holding the beer up to a light. They're also not entirely opaque. They have some nice clarity. It's just hard to notice with the beer being darker. They have good head retention, typically, with an off-white to light tan head. It's not quite what I would call pillowy head, but it's usually nice and thick. They're really quite nice-looking beers. This description is, of course, what a modern English Porter is like. There have been quite a lot of variations over the years. Porters have been around in one form or another for roughly 300 years, so it's bound to go through some changes over the years. They originally became popular in London around the start of the Industrial Revolution. There are many competing origin stories for the style, but no one really knows which is the most accurate. We do know that the style was likely named for the baggage carriers, the porters, who aided travelers coming in and out of London. This was the inexpensive beer the working class of London drank at the end of a hard day's work. In the mid-1700s, brewing was massively industrialized. A lot of things were, that's why it was called a revolution. But porter was a real driving force behind industrialization. Massive breweries were built to keep up with demand, and these massive breweries had seriously massive fucking beer vats in them. There's a crazy story where, and this is later, this is in 1814, but a huge vat of porter burst, and it in turn took out all the other beer vats in this brewery. It was the Horseshoe Brewery, and it was responsible for what we now call the London Beer Flood. So get this, more than 323,000 gallons of beer flooded the streets, destroying 2 homes and killing 8 people in the process. Can you imagine the sight of that? A fucking beer tsunami? The brewery was taken to court, but the incident was deemed an act of God, meaning the brewery was not liable for damage, leaving those whose homes were destroyed shit out of luck. That sounds like some shit we would do in America. You know, protect the corporation at the expense of the people. Whatever. It's sad, but it's still a good story. So, at first, porter was brewed using only brown malt. But when William Nicholson developed an accurate hydrometer, brewers realized that pale malts were more efficient and cost-effective because they contained more sugar. That didn't happen until around 1790. Then a guy named Daniel Wheeler invented a revolutionary device for kilning and roasting malt. This was in the early 1800s, not long after the beer flood. This black patent malting drum allows maltsters to make a super dark malt without burning it. So together, these two inventions, the hydrometer and the roasting drum, changed the porter game forever. After that, brewers reformulate their porter recipes. They use like 95% pale malt as a base malt, and the rest is black patent malt. Even at such a small percentage, the black patent malt makes the beer dark, gives it some roasty character. These reformulated porters are much closer to what we have today than any previous iterations of a beer called porter. This also opens the door for stout porters, which eventually gets shortened to simply stouts. So real quick, when you're making malt, first you want to dry the harvested barley grains. That way they can be stored until you're ready to use them. Then when it's time, you have to get that moisture back in the grains by soaking them in water. This will begin the germination process, which activates the enzymes in the kernels. Then the grains are ready to be colored by the maltster. They can either be kilned or stewed or roasted, depending on what kind of malt is desired. It's all very intricate and very cool. So yeah, porters dominate the beer landscape in England for decades. Then in the 1850s, pale bitter beers take over as the most popular style of British beer. By the time World War I rolls around, porters are practically extinct, and they stay that way until American craft brewers revive the style in the 70s. That's when it evolves into what we now just call the American porter style, which, as you should know by now, just means it is bigger, bolder, stronger, hoppier. Some characteristic ingredients in an English porter would be some kind of chocolate or other dark roasted malt. Caramel malt is also common. What else? I already mentioned how English and American porters differ. They have more substance and roast than a British brown ale, and they are higher in gravity than a dark mild. Some vital statistics: IBUs range from 18 to 35, so nothing too extreme, but still some noticeable bitterness. SRM ranges from 20 to 30. That would be reddish brown to, very dark brown. Almost black, but not quite. ABV can range from 4 to 5.4%, so pretty average, I would say. Sessionable, for sure. Like I said before, you may have a hard time tracking down a good example of this style, depending on where you are in the world. I know in the St. Louis area, your best bet would either be Fuller's London Porter or Samuel Smith Taddy Porter. Both are excellent beers if you can find them fresh. If they're not fresh, you'll know. They'll just be kind of sweet, but not in a good way, and flat. And who knows, maybe they'll have a distinct note of wet cardboard, too. But like I said, if you can find it fresh, jump on that shit, because these beers sure are tasty when they're fresh. They are flavorful and invigorating. So, let me think. Did I forget anything? Did we cover it all? I think we're good. I think we're ready to move on to some homebrew tips with Thomas. I'm going to take a break, and we'll get into it. Sit tight.